Hi, my name is Christopher Gardner. I'm a nutrition scientist, professor of medicine at Stanford University. I'm really thrilled to have been invited to share with you learners my take on the field of nutrition in this continuing medical education offering. My outline is going to include 4 main topics. There's going to be a lot of mini topics in between. The one I like to start with is, hey, how do we know what we know from a scientific basis? So many things in the medical literature, so many things in the general media. Oh my God, social media. How do you know this stuff? So I want to present this very complicated slide just to admit how complex this is. I think from my perspective, the public wants to know, wow, should I be vegan or keto, or should I try a more Scandinavian diet? Are there benefits to that? Because my interests, I'd like to live a long time. I would like to not have heart disease or cancer. And the truth is that as a nutrition scientist, I do a lot of human intervention studies. I have worked on observational epidemiological studies. It's usually not as broad as that. We usually take this down to the level of foods that make up those different patterns of diets. And actually, many of the same patterns share some of the same foods. That must be obvious, right? So there isn't any one food that's only part of one diet. And then all the foods have a bunch of nutrients in them: fats, carbs, proteins, vitamins, minerals. They certainly share a lot of those. That's the micro level. If we go to the health outcomes side of the equation where I do my studies, I have to say selfishly, I don't usually do heart disease or cancer studies. That requires a really long time to wait and see who has an event, who you see in the hospital as survivors, as people suffering, patients suffering from some of these conditions. But before they have an event, one of the ways to prevent that is to be doing your clinical work, checking their markers of inflammation, their lipid panel, their glucose, blood pressure, lots of different things you can do there from a scientific perspective. From some of those domains, think of what I have to work with as study outcomes. I can look at anything in the lipid panel: LDL, HDL triglycerides. I could look at small, dense LDL particles. I could look at insulin, but actually that's not a standard clinical measure these days, is it? Glucose is. So I could look at that. There's just so many choices. None of your patients are getting inflammatory marker numbers, are they? But kind of the whole medical community agrees inflammation is a hot topic. So when I work with colleagues and I apply for grants and I'm reading the literature, I tell you what I'm seeing a lot of. I'm seeing a lot of very single nutrient type interventions. Those can be pill versus placebo. It's almost like a drug trial. And we're looking at what happens after a few weeks or months to some kind of modifiable risk factor. And then when the headline gets to it, it says, so Professor Gardner, why did you do this? Oh, that nutrient is characteristic of this food, which is characteristic of this pattern, which leads me to believe I'm hoping that the people who follow this pattern will not have the adverse outcome that is related to that single outcome clinical measure that I looked at. Well, if you can imagine, there's a lot of room for confusion there, because some of these things, when given, maybe in a different dose, from a different source of food, maybe from a different length of time, might have a different impact. So you could have study A saying yes and study B saying no, looking like it's contradictory, when in fact, if you got down to the details to see who it was, what dose and source you were using, those results might look like they're polar opposites in the headlines, but actually be consistent. Yes, it may help this person. No, it may not help that person. And I'm hoping I can help you as clinicians and health professionals sort through some of this as you're in your business, in your practice. So here's another way I represent the kinds of things that I look at from a study design perspective, how we know what we know. So we can either work with population level data or individual level data. I can get nutrition data and health outcome data from the country level, but I would certainly rather have it from the individual. What are you eating as an individual, and what was your personal health outcome? And then for study designs, I can do observation or interventional, right? The observationals are always going to be association, not cause and effect, but there's even subgroups of that. I can do cross-sectional studies that are very quick to do in time because they are cross-sectional. The longitudinal observational cohort studies, oh my gosh, those take decades. They aren't even as good as an intervention study, which might just be the risk factor, Could be that somebody changes a risk factor in a positive way, but still has an adverse health outcome because of something else that the diet affected other than the one risk factor I was looking at. So even more compelling if I get to look at the disease outcome. For me as a health professional, I'm also more interested in primary prevention than secondary. So if I had my goal, if I had an unlimited budget, I would get individual level nutrition data and health outcome data. I would do the intervention, wait for the disease, and have it be primary prevention. If you can imagine, that's rare. Usually I have to use other sources of data that are quicker, less expensive, and contribute to our knowledge. They're not quite as compelling, but better than not having any studies. And that's part of what I'm going to go through. And I want to point out that if we're looking at something like iron and treating anemia, oh my God, that's very easy to do. We know what foods, what doses, what sources. We know women differ than men. The onset of anemia is quick. The resolution can be quick if we treat it properly. Plenty of studies. We learned that long ago. Strength of the evidence is high. Then as you move from nutrients to foods, foods are more complicated. They have multiple nutrients. And food patterns or food culture, wow, they share some of the same foods. The evidence gets less and less compelling, mostly because it's less and less available. And as we move from acute onset to chronic disease, same thing. As we move toward chronic disease, fewer studies, harder to look at, unless maybe we look at the underlying risk factors. I can measure lipids or blood pressure, inflammatory markers day to day, month to month, year to year. So I probably have more risk factor studies than I do hard outcome studies. The one I'd really like to answer is the questions that are in this cell. Should I go vegan so that I won't have a heart attack? Yeah, we don't really have any RCTs like that, and we're not going to. So just appreciate that in this model here, if it's an isolated nutrient and an acute onset disease, that is much easier to address as a research question than both of these, which are much more confusing because of the complexity of the food pattern and takes a much longer time to study. And I try to piece all these together and come up with evidence that will help you as health professionals talk to your patients. All right. Another way to look at it is like this. Here's the whole set of foods your patient is eating. Here's a single food they're eating. Here's a single nutrient that they're eating. And you as a clinician can't measure every risk factor, but you can measure some of them. And you're hoping to prevent this disease, but actually you're hoping they have a full life. They don't have cancer or heart disease or diabetes, but that's a fishing expedition. So quite frequently, we can only look at one thing at a time when we do a study. So hopefully some of what I'm going to share with you will help you talk to a patient so that they can change some intake of nutrient in their diet to lower a risk factor that you can help monitor to prevent a future outcome disease. And yet it still needs to fit back in the pattern of the whole diet, overall set of risk factors, and overall health. Whew. So that's why at the end of the day, I do human trials, but I cite in my research papers the plausibility and the mechanisms from animal studies, tissues and organs, cell and molecular studies, and I look to epidemiology for trends that we see in different countries and different populations that are eating one way or another. At the end of the day, I get to do very few clinical trials because I first need all that observational evidence to justify there's a reason to do the study. And I need to cite the research of my colleagues for the mechanistic plausibility. But even clinical trials have some limitations. These tend to be a single dose in a single type of person for a single outcome. And if somebody asks me, oh, what about a different dose? What about a different population? What about a different health outcome? I might have studied butter or fiber or whole grains. And it's just hard to come up with an overall conclusion. Is coffee good or bad for you? Oh my God. Think about coffee as one example. Seems like kind of a neutral idea. A lot of people drink coffee. A lot of people enjoy coffee. Oh, doc, you know, I'm a cancer survivor and I'm a real coffee lover. I drink about 4 cups a day. What do you think? Well, wow, should I do an intervention study where I take cancer survivors and I give some 4 cups of coffee a day versus what? None? Versus tea? And any kind of coffee or a specific kind of coffee? Should I do lattes? Okay, I'll just pick lattes. Oh my God, what milk did they put in it? Dairy milk, full fat, no fat, plant-based milk. Okay, so I've got cancer as an outcome. Now I'm gonna have to wait years to see what happens in this study, but I picked a population that's relevant for this outcome. It's gonna take me a decade. I might need 10,000 people. This is a lot of bucks. It's not really likely I'm gonna pull this off soon. And then change some of these outcomes. What if you say, oh no, never mind. Actually, what I'm really interested in is if a cup of mocha java once a day would bring joy to just about everyone, I could do that study in a month with 100 people. I'm not sure how important this study would be. And I'm pretty sure not all 100 people would get joy just from drinking this mocha java. But it would certainly be a much different question than that first one I posed. So helping you with the evidence to talk to your patient and just, I want you to feel my pain a little. I'm the interventionist. I'm the nutrition scientist who has to do this. And it's tough. I'll give you another example that's going to lead me into inflammation and immune function. We recently did a study on alternative plant-based meats, okay? And I want to frame this as a testable hypothesis. That's what I have to do to get funded. And I did get funded, and I did pull it off. And we, for the time being, were interested in generally healthy adults, but we could have picked people with elevated lipids, or we could have picked people with heart disease. We did make it more generalizable this way, but less room for improvement, maybe. We asked them to eat the Beyond Meat type of plant-based meat. I want to full disclosure, I got the funding to do this from Beyond Meat. So yes, I'm an industry shill. I took industry funding. I'm not sure the NIH would have funded me to do this. What was the dose? We used 2 servings a day. Whew. Think that was a good choice? Was that too much? Was that too little? Maybe it should have been twice a week. Twice a week, I'm not sure what impact I would be able to measure as an investigator that would be detectable. 1 serving a day, that would have been about 10 or 12% of their calories. We decided 2 servings a day. I think you should question me. I think you should be critical. We were only going to do this for 8 weeks. And we thought, oh my gosh, if we're going to get some kind of signal that we can detect, it's going to have to be a pretty hefty dose. This ended up being about 25% of their calories for the day. And instead of what? That's a huge important question to me. What are we replacing lentils with these Beyond Meat burgers? No. It seems like the relevant public health question is, could you be eating less red meat if you were having the Beyond Meat? So did we get fast food? Did we order Burger King and McDonald's? No, actually, we went with a San Francisco provider that prides itself on getting pasture-raised, organic, antibiotic-free red meat, top quality red meat. And it wasn't just burgers. We actually used burgers, crumbles versus ground beef. We had several types of Beyond Meat sausages versus red meat sausages. And what did we look at for 8 weeks? We looked at trimethylamine oxide. Stan Hazen from the Cleveland Clinic has suggested this is an important emerging risk factor. We looked at other things, but this is one of the ones we looked at. And this led to an interesting finding that I'll expand on in just a minute. We called it the swap meat study. I hope you appreciate the pun of our acronym for our study design. We had this published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. A fabulous postdoc, Anthony Cromarco, led this effort, published in 2020. And we had the 2 phases. We did this as a crossover. So 36 people did this. They did 8 weeks of one and then 8 weeks of the other in random order. That makes sense, right? So here's just a quick version of our study design in this crossover. We even followed them for a few weeks afterwards. I won't be able to present that data today, but we looked at what they were eating later on. 2 servings a day of Beyond Meat or animal meat. And what we did, as I'm sure you can probably imagine, is we delivered some food, asked them to do the rest of the food on their own. So they were responsible for the buns on their burger, for the lettuce and tomatoes, for the mayonnaise or ketchup. They were asked to do it the same way for both burgers, whichever way it was, white bun, or whole wheat bun. We had them bleed for us so we could look at kind of different clinical markers. We have some stool collections. So we've been looking at the microbiome, which I'm going to expand on. Did diet assessments, study questionnaires, lots of things like that. And at the end of the day, we lowered the trimethylamine oxide on the plant phase relative to the animal phase, and our primary outcome was significant. We looked at some other things that were not different on the 2 phases, IGF-1, insulin glucose lipids, HDL triglycerides were not different in the 2 phases. I'm going to skip weight for just a minute and jump to LDL cholesterol. There was less saturated fat in the plant meat than the animal meat, so I'm not too surprised that LDL cholesterol dropped by 10 milligrams per deciliter here. That was significant. I actually am surprised that the weight changed. According to their records, they were eating the same number of calories and they maintained the same level of physical activity. This is actually our most statistically significant finding, but interestingly, it wasn't much of a weight difference. It was 1 kilo. It was about 2 pounds. How can such a small, clinically almost meaningless difference be so statistically significant? Well, that happened because it was very consistent. Almost everybody was a couple pounds lower on the plant-based meat, which I can't explain because it seems like they have the same caloric intake and the same physical activity. I have to drop that for now, but that probably also helped in the LDL cholesterol lowering. Saturated fat, more fiber in the plant meat than the animal meat, which had no fiber, and lost a little weight. So that'll explain LDL. I want to drop just for a sec to the blood pressure, because blood pressure was claimed to be a problem for these plant-based meats, which are high in sodium. It turned out that people who got the red meat were salting their red meat. And by the time we looked at the whole day of 25% of calories from plant meat, 25% from animal meat, and looked at the sodium content of both diets, it's virtually identical. And that's what happened with blood pressure. So I actually think it's significant that there was not a significant change in blood pressure, because they've been bad-mouthed in the past about this. So these are my industry shill findings. Yes, they funded me. We did a lot of things to do this objectively as possible. Data lockdown, third-party analysis, made the data public. This was our finding. This is the way we asked this one study. It doesn't answer questions about other doses, other people, or anything like that. But we did have a fascinating finding about the microbiome and immune function. So one of the things that happened in our study was this trimethylamine oxide, which is generated from the precursors of carnitine and choline that come from red meat in the microbiome bacteria, was a little bit different depending on which one you did first, plant meat or animal meat. And unfortunately, I won't have time to go into the details of that, but I want that to lead us to, oh my gosh, TMAO, inflammatory factor, blood clotting. What could the microbiome have to do with that? And this has to do with how our diet affects the microbiome, and our microbiome affects immune function. So picture this cartoon of your intestinal tract. And on the one hand, we've got a high simple carb diet, eating some added sugars and refined grains. Hey, we humans have, somewhere close to 20 different genes to generate the enzymes to degrade those and absorb them. Boom, done. Nothing left to go down to the colon there. The microbiome, oh, look at the poor bacteria. They're just languishing here because they love carbohydrate-like sources to live off of, and they are being starved here. Look how sad they are. Okay, then try eating some broccoli, which has some starch in it. You'll get some glucose, and you'll break that down with your small number of genes that make a small number of enzymes. And you'll get some energy from the carbs in the broccoli, but a lot of that fiber that came in the broccoli, the whole definition of fiber is it's indigestible by human enzymes. We don't have them to make it small enough to absorb, so they go down the pipe to the colon. Ah, look at the happy bacteria. There they are, they're in heaven. They're chewing up this fiber from the broccoli. They're generating microbiota metabolites like short-chain fatty acids. Those are being absorbed in the colon. They're going into the circulation. One of my partners, Michael Fischbach, has identified about 100 different small molecules that the microbiome generates. This particular graphic, I want to give credit to Justin and Erica Sonnenberg. They're my microbiology partners. They developed this great graphic that I've been borrowing, and want to make sure I give credit to them. And they came up with this term: not all carbohydrates feed the microbiome. They consider the ones that are the best, and they haven't clarified what these are individually for every fiber, but microbiota, accessible carbohydrates. Ah, Mac, it's like a Big Mac diet. Ah, I know, terrible joke, sorry, Big Mac diet. But you want a lot of microbiota accessible carbohydrates in your diet. Woo! So those are two very different scenarios. If you're eating simple carbs versus complex carbs, if you're eating processed food versus whole plant foods, the latter is likely to make your microbiota very happy, and the other one will just give you quick calories and surge your blood sugar and your insulin. right? So one of the ideas here is fuel the gut microbiota, eat your plant-based foods. So one of the goals there is it will help improve your immune function. And here's a rationalization that comes from my esteemed colleague, Justin Sonnenberg. This is his electron microscopy picture. He actually won an award for this picture for the photograph. So these are all the different strains of bacteria stained in different colors. Isn't this elegant? I really don't know how you stain bacteria in different colors, but he does. And the blue over here, these are actually the nuclei of the colonocytes. So here's your colon cells. What is this green slimy thing in the middle? This is actually, they've stained the mucus lining that protects your body and your colon cells from the interior of your intestinal tract with all the noxious stuff that's coming down the pipe that you didn't absorb. And so he's done some studies about what would happen with different food sources when the trillions of microbial cells have access to what you're feeding them. So here's some mice getting a whole food diet, and here's some mice getting a junk diet. And here's another one of his pictures of electron microscopy. So we're going to look at functionality and composition. So here's the fiber-rich diet over here, but we've flipped it now. So now I got the nuclei of the cells on the left and the intestinal tract right here on the right. So there's the lumen of the colon. Here's this thick barrier, mucus, and a little bit of debris there as the bacteria are chopping things up. Good distance between them, right? In a fiber deficient diet, this is what he finds in mice, is the mucus lining is actually composed of carbohydrate-like substances that can fuel the bacteria. And so the bacteria here are actually eating and thinning the protective mucus lining in the colon of these mice, suggesting that if this does continue, then whatever is in the intestinal tract is going to gain access to our systemic circulation. And here's a cartoon of almost the same thing. Here's a high diversity fiber-rich diet and this thick mucus lining and the short chain fatty acids migrating across it into the cells. A lot of these are probably good for immune function. And then next, we're not eating a high fiber diet, but we're getting them from supplements. We're getting a whole bunch of different fiber from supplements, but not as many as food would have. So it thins a little here. How about just a single fiber supplement and a crappy diet, a SAD diet, a standard American diet that doesn't have a lot of fiber in it? So that's not generating many short chain fatty acids, and it's thinning again. And here we've got no fiber supplement, very little fiber in the diet. And this has thinned so much that we have some intrusion. We have leaky gut syndrome going on. This is what may be happening in terms of the microbiome, and a healthy versus depleted microbiome serving a function for immune system. One of the other ways to look at this is to go and look at traditional hunter-gatherer tribes. So if we look over the history of time, it's been mostly hunter-gatherer, then agrarian, and then most recently industrial. So for some of the few tribes that remain like this may look like a whole bunch of just sticks on the fire, but some of these are tubers that they're roasting and cooking, and then they're going to eat them. A whole lot of fiber in those. Definitely much more fiber than in the French fries many of our kids are eating and our colleagues and neighbors. So I can't explain this slide very well. This is another one borrowed from the Sonnenberg lab. This is suggesting, I can't actually explain the x-axis, but I know this has to do with the diversity of microbes. This is showing that across quite a few hunter-gatherer tribes around the world, despite very different geographic locations, they share a very interesting balance of microbes, and very different than a whole bunch of Western countries, which are missing this set of microbes, and they have a different set over here in industrialized populations. Again, many different parts of the world, but stunning how they share these same characteristics and differences. To be even a little more specific, here's the same picture on top that was at the bottom a moment ago. And here's 3 specific families or strains of bacteria that are found in the hunter-gatherers, but not in industrialized nations. Whereas this one here is found only in the industrialized countries, but not in the hunter-gatherer tribes. This is a hot new topic, the microbiome. Are we depleting our microbiome by eating a Western diet? We think so. Is this having an adverse effect on immune function? We think so. So look, again, looking back over time, here's hundreds of grams of fiber from the tubers that they were eating, moving into the agricultural era where Americans have as a recommended daily allowance about 35 grams of fiber a day. But in our industrialized society with all the processed sanitized food, our average intake in the US anyway is about 15 grams a day, far short of the recommended daily allowance, which is far short of what we probably evolved eating in terms of grams of fiber. And let me show you a mouse model of this that builds on that ecological data I just showed you. So the Sonnenbergs took a bunch of mice over multiple generations, and there was high fiber diet and a low fiber diet. So picture one set consistently got high fiber, one set started with high fiber, got moved to low fiber, and then got high fiber added back to it. So let's see how this low microbiota accessible carbohydrate diet influenced diversity over generations. Here is the initial. This is supposed to reflect all the different bacterial species in a single graph. And this is abundance. The darker colors is more abundant. By the time you get to white, the abundance is very low. So picture, here's the mice that get to go in the first generation on a low MAC diet. And then afterward, they get more fiber added. So let's see if they bounce back. It looks like they lost a lot of the bacterial diversity and it bounced back a little, but not completely with the high fiber diet. Let's do their kids. Oh my gosh, their kids had an even more depleted microbiome. Again, they bounced back a little when they switched them to high fiber, but not so much. And let's look at their kids and their kids. Okay, so look, all this diversity is lost over 4 generations. And at that point, feeding them a high fiber diet is not enough to let them get it back. And now let's look at the paired mice that were just getting a high fiber diet, all generations, all time points. This is an urgent matter. Not only are we losing this, but as the Sonnenbergs inform me, we're at risk of losing these forever and not being able to recover from this depletion of our microbiome. What impact does that have for immune function? That seems to be a little scary. We should do whatever we can to not deplete our microbiome even further. And could we increase the diversity? So I've been doing a half dozen trials with a microbiome. I've been doing those with the Sonnenbergs, feeding them fiber-rich foods, fermented foods, both, supplements with single strains, some supplements with multiple. We don't have all the answers yet, but we are trying to open this up. And the key to our studies here is usually for my group to modify the diet, for the Sonnenberg lab to characterize the microbiome. And then we take this to Stanford's Human Immune Monitoring Center, run by the incredible Dr. Mark Davis and Dr. Holden Maker. And they have a number of immune profiling assays that they can run to look at what impact this is having. So very promising, early work. Sorry I don't have more. That is the nature of science. It's very slow to move forward on how we're going to help you figure out what to tell your patients about the microbiome and immune function. I'm working on it. I'm not going to know next week either, but tune in and we will do the most we can. That is the process for doing that. And eventually, if it was like 50 years ago, hopefully we will have evidence like this back when it was just micronutrients and we were looking at minerals and vitamins, trying to figure out what health outcomes they were related to and how we could address those. We came up with a range of essential vitamins and minerals that were required for optimal health. And the CDC has identified this set of 6 as being micronutrients of concern. And now I won't have time to go through all the evidence. I'll just say, all this evidence came up decades ago. And we know iron is crucial for cognitive development, motor skills, need it for hemoglobin and some hormones. And we know there's quite a few children that have an iron deficiency under the age of 5. We know that many pregnant women have an iron deficiency, and this is really important for blood supply for the infant they're growing. And so we go to the food world and agriculture and find that heme iron is going to be in meats. That's a great source. To a lesser extent, but still some in poultry, but there are actually a lot of plant foods that have non-heme iron. That's just basically just elemental iron. You'd probably want to have some citrus or some vitamin C with that to keep the iron reduced. So you'd increase the rate of absorption. The rate of heme iron absorption is probably about 20% in terms of bioavailability For plants, it's more like 10%, but you can certainly get enough iron on a plant-based diet. But if you are anemic and having trouble, heme iron from some plant sources, that basically you're eating some of the blood containing meats, would have some heme iron in it. The next one would be vitamin A. This is present in many foods. If you really just wanted direct vitamin A, probably be the liver is the best source. But there's actually a picture here of all the different fruits and vegetables that have beta carotene. Beta carotene gets converted into vitamin A easily in the body. And there's often populations suffering from vitamin A deficiency. A lot of infant deaths. Let's see in my next one, eyesight issues, xerophthalmia, a horrific eye condition. It's leading to dried out, cracked eyes, infections, dried out, cracked skin, infections. And vitamin A, working in a hormone-like function, can prevent that. So you could get it from animal liver, but you could also get it from fish, leafy greens, broccoli, carrots, a bunch of these things that are brightly colored. You could get them from fortified cereals. So pretty much anything that's going to be red or yellow, or many of these green foods here have chlorophyll and beta carotene, and the chlorophyll actually overpowers the beta carotene. So you see mostly green and not red and yellow. But if you want to get any kind of red or yellow bell pepper or something like that, that's going to have a lot of beta carotene. Cherries, tomatoes, things like that. So lots of options for vitamin A, and often for these populations that are suffering from vitamin A deficiency, the sources are there in their community, in their tribe where their community lives, and they're just not accessing it. Another nutrient of interest, according to the CDC, is folic acid, also known as B9, but I don't think anybody calls it B9 anymore. We always just say folate. It's crucial for making nucleotides, so for DNA replication and new cells in the body. Got to have enough folate. Definitely needed for development of brain and spine. It can reduce neonatal deaths. So the most famous case of this are the neural tube defects. This is the most serious outcome of a folate deficiency. And for this, you actually need to be folate deficient right at the start of pregnancy, as cells are dividing the fastest, and often before the woman even knows she's pregnant. So this has to be an adequate folate supply ahead of time. It's also related to premature birth, low birth weight, and some other neonatal deaths. Open sores in the tongue. Megaloblastic anemia would be sort of the simplest, most short-term thing. You're going to see large, pale red cells, because in the process of creating new red blood cells, you didn't have enough for cell replication, and the replication stopped, and you ended up with big, pale red blood cells. Megaloblastic anemia is not nearly as severe as some of the other conditions, and once you've identified this with some tests, you may be able to help patients who are suffering from some of the symptoms here that would be related to megaloblastic anemia. Pretty easy to find in beans, greens, and citrus. There are many fortified cereals that have folic acid. The US actually fortifies the whole US wheat supply with folic acid. So I hate to say this, but if you're getting refined white wheat, you're getting it that way. I would certainly prefer you get it from your beans, greens, and citrus. But since the US started fortifying the food supply in about 1996 with folic acid, we have seen drops, clear marks in neural tube defects. So that was an outcome. The evidence yielded a solution. It wasn't just asking women to eat more folate because they weren't doing it when they got asked. Oh, you're of childbearing age, you might want to do this because you need to be sufficient before you get pregnant, actually. Yeah, that didn't work so well. So we just fortified the whole US food supply, and that seemed to help. So interesting public health strategy on folic acid. Zinc, oh my gosh, zinc is part of about 300 different enzymes in the body. It also affects synthesis and function of DNA and proteins. In some parts of the world, up to 30% of people are at risk of zinc deficiency due to dietary inadequacy. So may help prevent premature birth, diarrhea, respiratory infections. You can find zinc actually mostly in animal foods more than plant foods. So here's a whole bunch on the left where you would find zinc. Also can get it in whole grains, beans and nuts, some in dairy, but also in fortified breakfast cereals. I actually don't want to push you too much toward those sugary, refined grain, fortified breakfast cereals, but this is one positive thing that many of those breakfast cereals have is they pump them full of nutrients. I'd rather have you get them from foods, but that is one source. And vitamin D. So this sort of is the nutrient of the decade as far as I can tell. I see paper after paper of interventions with vitamin D. I have to say most of them are failing that I follow in the literature. If you want to look at function, it clearly helps with the maintenance of calcium balance in the body. So that's very important. Mechanistically, yes, for resisting bacteria and viruses, possible there, possible regulating blood sugar levels, muscle and nerve function, all plausible functions. It looks like for many people, there's a global deficiency in vitamin D. Is that because we're using so much sunscreen at high SPF that we're not getting enough vitamin D from the sun? That's actually the most natural way to get it. We have a lot of older folks staying inside all the time. We have kids staying inside, playing video games, not being outside, going outside with umbrellas, avoiding the sun. It might be that we're avoiding so much sun that some of these vitamin D supplements would help the people who are in need of that, because rickets and osteoporosis are certainly related to vitamin D deficiency. There are many other possibilities, such as depression or multiple sclerosis. I have to say, I keep following the literature, and as many intervention trials as have been done with vitamin D that are out there, most of the ones I see are failing. I would stick with the rock solid bone effects, calcium metabolism regulation. The other ones are possible. The interesting thing is there's not that many great sources in our food system. So fatty fish, liver, egg yolks, fortified milk because it's fortified. Mushrooms is an interesting source, but how many mushrooms do you eat in a day? Cheese, probably because it came from fortified milk. It's really sunlight is the primary source of vitamin D, but for many people not getting appropriate exposure to sunlight, just a small amount of healthy sunlight could be as little as 10 or 30 minutes for some people, not even your whole body, just parts of your body, but that doesn't work for everyone. So maybe some vitamin D supplements. If not, here are some of the few food sources of zinc. And I believe our last one is iodine. Here's a mineral we need for thyroid hormone in the body, but it has lots of different functions with bone, cognition, metabolism. Across the planet, quite a few people have an insufficient iodine intake. It happens most often when most of your foods are coming from a very distinct geographic region and the iodine has washed out of the soil. So actually one of the best ways to prevent it is to get foods that have been grown in multiple places in the world. That way you would avoid getting all your food from the place that is the most deficient, where it's been washed out of the soil. Okay, but if you are deficient, right, it could lead to stunted growth, intellectual disabilities, developmental issues, ability to work and think clearly. So it can be very serious. Found in fish and dairy, and in the US, here's another one where we fortify salt with it. So we have iodized salt. I'll tell you, as a health professional, I'm struggling a little here. I'm trying to keep your salt down for blood pressure, but if you're iodine deficient, it can be serious also. So find some balance here between some light salting of your food with iodized salt and getting a wide diversity of foods. So this list isn't complete because it can be in so many foods if they're grown in soils that have iodine. So a diverse food supply and a little iodized salt, maybe some fish and dairy. So this is the set of 6 nutrients that the CDC identified as being micronutrients of concern for optimal health, particularly among vulnerable populations, getting your food from one area, pregnancy, children, infants in utero. So that was just a quick summary. It's not really, doesn't really do full justice to all the nutrients that are out there and all the foods that are sources of them. But I hope that quick overview of 6 nutrients was helpful to the learners. Okay, take a deep breath. We're going to move on to some practical ways to apply this. So gone over how we know what we know. I went through some specific nutrients where I didn't go through any of the evidence. I just said, this is now what we do with the evidence. This is what we recommend. But people don't go to the grocery store to buy nutrients. They go to the grocery store to buy foods. So I want to give you more of a health focus approach on some of the controversies that are out there and some tips how to wade through all of that. The first one's going to be, in my world, I've helped sit in on groups like the American Diabetes Association, the American Heart Association. I've sat in on a group called the Menus of Change, which is a bunch of scientists and business folks working with chefs. And when we work on recommendations, we usually get quite a diverse group of people trying to represent different fields and different specialties. I find that we actually agree much more than the public would think. So I can tell you the two most distinct polarized diets in my world right now that I hear battling on Twitter and social media are low-fat vegans and ketogenic folks. I really can't think of any two more polar opposites than those. And yet, I actually got to moderate a debate between them in front of a medical conference where I got them all to agree, yeah, people should eat more vegetables and more whole foods and have less added sugar and refined grain, and less processed food. This is a big deal. Americans don't eat many vegetables or whole foods, and I've got a paper that I won't have time to share with you that shows about 40% of US calories come from crappy carbohydrates, those added sugars and refined grains in processed foods. Oh my gosh, if you could replace that 40% with these, you'd make both the keto and the low-fat vegans happy, right? Okay, but beyond them, there's also another circle, another level of foods that maybe not all the vegans and maybe not all the keto folks would agree with, but that's small percentages at the ends of the spectrum. Almost everybody else agrees on beans, fruits, nuts, eggs, fish. So for example, to say, oh my God, there's lectins in the beans, the fruits have sugar, the nuts have fat, the eggs have cholesterol, the fish have a face, poor vegetarians. Okay, we'll get over it because most health professionals agree the benefits of the fiber and the nutrients and the protein in beans far outweigh the lectins. The sugars in the fruits are in a food matrix that's way different than just getting a tablespoon of sugar. Sugar fruit is not the same as added sugar. The fats in nuts are unsaturated. That can be good for your lipid profile. The cholesterol in eggs, compared to saturated fat, there's actually not much saturated fat in eggs. There is a lot of cholesterol, but metabolically, cholesterol has a much smaller impact than saturated fat. So it depends what you're replacing the eggs with there. And the fish have the omega-3s, good source of protein. There's better and worse ways to catch fish. There's farmed fish and wild fish, but let's just go nutrient-wise. Fish have good nutrients. So most health professionals agree on that outer rim, and everyone agrees on the inner circle. If you want to move out a little further than that, you could have a war about grains or poultry if you wanted, but wouldn't that change if instead of just grains, you were talking about whole grains and even whole intact grains? Okay, and that might mean steel cut oats, brown rice, wheat berries. I make a kick-ass wheat berry salad. Personally want to show my pride in that. Barley in a nice barley soup. That would be very different than the grains in donuts, cookies, and refined breads. Not the same grains. We would agree. Most health professionals agree on this upper level. If the poultry is Kentucky Fried Chicken, grown in a concentrated animal feeding operation, infused with antibiotics and deep fried, that is not the same as some pasture-raised, regenerative farming, poultry grown in better ways, under better conditions, and eaten as a whole food. So let's try to agree as much as possible and not just demonize an entire food group and focus on the better sides. I don't have time to, but I could go into dairy. Yogurt, great source of dairy. Most health professionals agree. Go-gurt for your kids, that's not yogurt. That is a yogurt-like substance that's ultra-processed. Red meat, so are we talking fast food burgers covered in a white bun and slathered with sauces? Or are we talking about a nice cut of meat that's raised properly and served with appropriate preparation? Very different. So I think the foundational diet that 100% agreement is there for in terms of all health professionals and huge room for improvement because 40% of calories in the US diet are added sugars and refined grains and processed foods. This would be a big step. Let's get your patients to do this. Hey, learners. So focus on this. No matter what diet they're eating, there is massive agreement on that. And there's pretty good agreement on the rest of this. So I want you to be thinking that the nutrition community does not disagree as much as the headlines in the media make it out to be. By the time you get to actual foods and a plate of foods in front of you, most of us would agree on plate A versus plate B for these reasons. Another way to tease some of that apart, though, is to be thinking about the variability of one person versus another with the same food. So this is something that I've had to learn to do as a scientist. There isn't one best diet for everyone. I've had to learn to embrace the variability of the people in my studies. I'm only going to give you one quick example, which was one of my most famous studies was a weight loss study in 600 men and women over the course of a year. It was low fat versus low carb. It wasn't just low fat, low carb. We actually had the dietitians that were coaching our participants to eat the healthiest possible low fat and the healthiest possible low carb. And I got all the individuals to let us print their data as single individuals. This isn't a mean and a standard deviation or standard error. Each one of these bars is one woman or man in the study after a year. And I hope you'll see that these are kilos, not pounds, that some of the men and women over the course of the year lost 20 kilos. Not bad, huh? Some of them in a weight loss study gained 5 or 10. Bless these people for coming back to let us weigh them instead of saying, oh my God, I don't want to come back. I gained weight instead of lost weight. Kudos to them for coming back. It shows that, we actually did have some people who very much struggled, couldn't lose weight, actually gained weight. But just think of this 10 kilo of gain and 20 kilo of loss, those aren't outliers. This is an absolute continuum from one end to the other. And in terms of healthy low fat versus healthy low carb, the difference was 1 or 2 pounds on average. But doesn't that mask the fascination that all these people got the same advice and they had different responses? All these people got the same advice and they had very different responses. This study, which we call Diet Fits, was actually designed to test effect modification. We actually thought there was a metabolic predictor, and that would be insulin resistance, that would predict differential success. And we actually thought we had a genotype pattern that would predict better success on one or the other. The main shot of this study, which I don't have time to share with you in detail, is that both of our predictors failed. The genotype and the metabolic predisposition factors that we were looking at didn't explain who is more or less successful. So that part was a disappointment for me, but you can't take the variability away. It's still there. I still have to do it. Is it the microbiome? Is it immune function? Is it sleep patterns? We did adjust for everything that we could adjust for and controlled for everything that we could control for. But this is it, that there is no one diet that works for everybody. And basically all diets work for at least one person as far as we can tell. And then that one person goes around shouting, oh my God, this is it. This is the best diet. Everyone should do what I do. But no, actually, if you find that, you should test it on a group of everyone and see if it works. And what typically is the case is all the diets work for some people and not for others. So be thinking of a sound, healthy low fat or healthy low carb. And both of those have the potential to be helpful for people at least 1 year out. In our study, we didn't get to track them for more years, but I want this to be a good example of embracing the variability, that there is room for precision nutrition. The sad answer is I don't have the answers what the precision is based on, not metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance according to the way we did our study, and not a genetic predisposition, but clearly there's room for looking for explanations for that. And I'm still looking, I'm not done, but I don't have another study at the moment doing that other than looking at the microbiome. Okay, yes, I am looking at it. I'm looking at the microbiome. And then in all the studies that you see in the headlines, I hope you'll at least pause for a minute to think about the differences between rigor and generalizability when you're talking to your patients. So dear learners, there are very different kinds of studies. And I want to bring up the one that I just showed you, which I think was rigorous in many, many ways. I did my best. I don't have time to go into it. It was also very generalizable. We recruited from the general population. We had hundreds of people. It took place over a year. They were making and buying all their own food. There are many aspects of generalizability there. I ramped up the rigor as high as I could, but Kevin Hall is much more rigorous than I am. In this study, Kevin Hall from the NIH and the NIDDK, Diabetes and Digestive Kidney Diseases, he got a group of 20 people who for 14 days ate an ultra-processed diet and for 14 days ate an unprocessed diet. It was a crossover study. Each person ate both for 14 days. They made the food for them. He calls it domiciling them. These were domiciled participants. I call them incarcerated. He locked them up in a building. I'm sure there were bars on the windows and locks on the doors. They made the food right there, slid it under the door. Okay, maybe they didn't slide it under the door. They probably served it to them on a dining room table, but they knew everything they ate. They knew everything they didn't eat. They collected the waste. They weighed them every day. They checked them out in metabolic chambers. They had really fabulous equipment to look in enormous detail at what was going on. And in the ultra-processed diet, which I don't have time to explain, but you can probably imagine heavily processed versus unprocessed food, they were actually eating more calories on the ultra-processed diet than they were on the unprocessed. And if you just track their weight for 14 days, which doesn't tell you what they're doing in a year, in 14 days, on ultra-processed, they were gaining weight, and on unprocessed, they were losing weight. This is fabulously rigorous, and I actually give Kevin Hall many kudos. If you see, he actually published a picture of every plate of the 14 days of food that they used in his study. It was pretty much the best you could do at taking real food and not giving them just milkshakes for the month. He really did real food. And the ultra-processed diet was pretty realistic when you look at it. It's what Americans are eating. And the unprocessed was very whole food oriented. This was great. He actually made this as generalizable as I think you could do for this type of study, but he focused on rigor, and he could do 20 people in 14 days. I was as rigorous as I could, but I wanted more generalizability, so I did 600 people for a year. Both of these studies are important as we do this kind of question asking and hypothesis testing. I'm going to cite Kevin, and Kevin's going to cite me, because we both add complementary angles to this. So when you are looking at the literature, and I'm sure your patient's going to say, "Doc, health professional, look, I just read this, or I saw it on Twitter, or it's trending on social media," hopefully you can take a fairly quick look and think, was it one of those really highly rigorous short-term studies? And how generalizable was it? Or was it a large study? How much rigor did they get into it? But how generalizable was it also? There's ways to maximize both of them, but there are trade-offs. The more generalizable tends to be less rigorous. The more rigorous tends to be less generalizable. And then part of that has to do with the continuum of what we have access to as scientists. We can focus on nutrients. I mean, if this is just a vitamin or mineral, it can be a pill and placebo. That can be super rigorous, but your patients eat food, right? They eat bread and eggs, and we could only change the bread or the eggs and nothing else. That might not be helpful. They eat a lot of things other than bread and eggs, so maybe that's not enough to make a difference. And maybe you want them to eat Mediterranean, or maybe you want them to try vegetarian, or maybe they're gone keto and they want to ask what you think of a ketogenic diet. Wow, it's a lot of different foods. So in terms of our rigor and our generalizability, part of what informs what we're looking at, trying to be critical of it, is it at the nutrient level, at the food level, or the food pattern? Part of this is the science side, and part of this is talking to your patients. Maybe they understand food patterns better, or maybe they think Mediterranean isn't that the diet where you drink a glass of olive oil at night? No, that's isolationist. That's drinking olive oil. We're talking about cooking with olive oil, putting it on a plant-based salad that's got all kinds of crunchy vegetables and great variety on it, right? That would be very different. So where are we in this continuum of food versus nutrient versus pattern? I'm going to give you some very specific examples of asking people to cut back on red meat, and they did, And what did they have instead? More pizza. What? Yes, more pizza on a white crust, loaded with processed cheese and high sodium tomato sauce. Is that what we were talking of? No, 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 no. When I said eat less red meat, I was thinking you would eat more of these. Lots of options. You can't just say eat less without telling them what to shift to, what to eat more of. So if they've got a question for your doc, should I eat more or less of this? Your first response should be, well, instead of what? What are you going to have instead of that? That's a hugely important part of the question to give them some guidance. So I'm going to use eggs as an even more explicit example here. Are eggs good or evil? I've heard both things come. I think that's a false dichotomy. Absolutely not. You could talk better or worse. That's a little better than evil or good, right? But it still is going to depend on context. And the two key phrases here that I use quite often, you've heard them so far already, instead of what? And this time with what? So think of this. This is eggs, but it's cheesy eggs. Yeah, I know people who like cheesy eggs. So is that the same egg if it has cheese on it? Is it the same egg if it comes with bacon and sausage, or is that a different egg? Well, the egg is the same, but it came with something different. How about a veggie omelet? What if you packed an omelet with veggies? Wow, might be a plant-based meal right there. So what's better, eggs with bacon and sausage, cheese, or veggies? I would pick the veggie as a nutrition scientist. There might be other arguments on other days for other choices, but I'm going to pick veggies, a veggie omelet, and then you can have your eggs. And if you're going to eat more veggies because you like veggie omelets, I'm kind of thrilled that you're having the eggs. The eggs are a vegetable delivery vehicle. How about that? Okay, so here's the veggie omelet compared to, steel-cut oats with berries and some yogurt. Wow, that is pretty good. That's a pretty plant-based option there. So veggie omelet, whole food plant-based, steel-cut oats, berries and yogurt, whole food plant-based. Oh my gosh. Both of those are better than Pop-Tarts, right? Oh my God, evil incarnate. There's Pop-Tarts, refined grain, sugar, ultra-processed. All right, so here's a little test for you. Think about your patient who comes in and says, Doc, I got this down. I'm having steel-cut oats every day of the week, but I want your advice. What should I have Sunday? Should I have steel-cut oats on Sunday? She said, no. Oh my God, get some variety in your diet, person. Have the eggs, have the veggie omelet. That's ridiculous. Don't eat the same thing for breakfast every day. Nothing has all the nutrients. The fun of food is different foods have different nutrients. And if we have a reasonable amount of variety in the diet, we'll get all the nutrients. If we really just focus on the same thing day after day, we're going to be missing some nutrients. So they come back later and say, Doc, I took your advice. So 3 days of the week, I'm having the steel-cut oats. And 3 days of the week, I'm having the eggs and the omelet. But I can't figure out what to have on Sunday now because there's an odd day of the week. Which one should I have? And at that point, I think you should just open up and cut them some slack and say, you know what? You could have the goddamn Pop-Tarts on the last day if you wanted. Oh, dear patient, I'm so thrilled with you. 6 days of the week, you are having a fabulous breakfast. I actually wish you had a little more variety than that. But you know, if you eat 6 days of the week really well, maybe there's some memory you had as a kid that you went out with your mom and dad and you woke up and had Pop-Tarts in the morning, and there's some part of your spirit that is fed by going back and enjoying a Pop-Tart every once in a while. That's not the same Pop-Tart as if you had refined cereal on day A and eggs and sausage and bacon the next day, and then Pop-Tarts, and those were your 3 meals. That wouldn't be the same Pop-Tart as these Pop-Tarts, right? Okay, so yeah, I prefer you not have the Pop-Tarts, but loosen up if they're eating really well already. One of my favorite chefs has an 80% rule. She eats 80% the right way, or she eats the right way 80% of the time. And then sometimes there's a joyous occasion, a room for celebration, a room to let loose. Just back off and don't be dogmatic about it. Have something like this every once in a while. Not everybody needs that, but for some people, it could actually help them stick to this on a more regular basis if once in a while they get something like this. So is there a better or a worse egg? I think the key is you've got to ask your patient instead of what and with what. So I'm going to end on the note of an aspirational diet. So here's a couple categories of the aspirational diet that I think of. And I've been playing around with this with young college students at Stanford. So they're in my classes. I actually work with some of the chefs and the dining hall operators at Stanford. And I am a nutrition scientist. I know a lot about metabolism. I know a lot about recommendations, the dietary reference intakes. I know the dietary guidelines for Americans. The students want to go in and enjoy their food. And many of them are social warriors, social justice warriors, or eco warriors. And they're really interested in the broader implications of our food choices. So from the taste perspective, I have had the great fortune of collaborating with the Culinary Institute of America, and Greg Drescher in particular is one of my heroes from this group. We have created this Menus of Change University Research Collaborative. It started as the Menus of Change, which was a scientific advisory board, a business board, and a chef board saying, how can we help the chefs think of something that's healthy and economically viable that they can do in their kitchens and their restaurants when they get confused by people saying gluten-free this week, vegan this week, paleo this week, Atkins and keto the next week. You know, what's good science makes good business sense, and that chefs can contribute to, because their craft is making things taste great. And so we're actually studying this in the dining halls of our universities now. We have 60 different universities that have joined this Menus of Change University Research Collaborative, and we are having a blast playing with the students. Here's one just quick example of what that looks like. I'm going to make fun of myself a little in this example. So we actually worked with a psych professor, Ali Crum, who came up with this idea, and Brad Turnwald, her PhD student, pulled this off at Stanford first, and then we replicated at 6 other universities across the country to show that it was replicable. We worked with chefs. Stanford in particular has, for example, 17 different vegetables that they cycle through in an academic quarter over the course of 10 weeks. Serve 2 or 3 vegetables every day, and they make them in different ways, and they name them different things. And we said, can we take those 17 vegetables, which will be served multiple times, and can we create a health-focused label, a basic label, and a taste-focused label of the same recipe, of the same vegetable, and we'll just rotate this through, and we'll see how many servings the students take over the course of the quarter. And we replicated this in other universities, and that's what this paper is from. These are all faculty and students from different universities. So in the taste focus, they took about 25% more servings compared to basic. Okay, now this is just going to kill me. Okay, so here's the type of name we had: high fiber carrots for health, just carrots for basic, or twisted citrus glazed carrots for taste focused. Okay, I'm sure you can imagine why they took 25% more twisted citrus glazed carrots than just carrots. But seriously, fiber is good for you. I've done studies. Fiber is better than just carrots. These are high fiber carrots or low sodium carrots. That's presence of a glorified or absence of a vilified thing in the carrots. That's an add-on. That's carrots plus. Well, I think when we label it healthy, students assume that it tastes worse than if they're just carrots. Isn't this sad? Okay, now the funny thing is, while the labeling changed, the recipe never did. They used the same recipe in each one. They did this for 17 vegetables. They did it across 6 universities. And this is the summary result, is that when you give it a health-focused name, students take less than if you just call it what it is, but they'll take more if from a culinary perspective, you say, this is a much more fun food. This is an indulgent food, right? So this is a fabulous experiment that we did in the dining hall. And we're trying to do this to see how to motivate students to make behavior change. We actually now have an edgy veggie toolkit that all universities can access that was developed as a result of this cross-university effort. So go to the Edgy Veggie Toolkit and you can see how to cleverly name things. You still have to make great tasting food. You can't fake them. In the sub-analysis, there's actually one university that didn't do quite as well as the others. And it turned out when we looked at what they were making, it wasn't very good. But provided the recipes are good, even just changing the name is one approach to behavior change. And then I actually teach some I teach human nutrition at Stanford. This is my 20th year of teaching human nutrition to undergrads. I teach another class called Food and Society, where I actually never talk about health. We really talk about things like planetary boundaries. This paper commissioned for the Eat Lancet group came up with a healthy planetary guideline and a global transformation diet. And in this one, they talk about 5 planetary boundaries, not only greenhouse gases and climate change. They talk about land use, water use, maintaining biodiversity, and eutrophication from excessive nitrogen and phosphorus runoff from agriculture. And across the 5 domains, it all points toward a more plant-based, less animal-centric diet. And that's the recommendation. And I have to say, those different components for the undergrads that I see, the 20-year-olds, they seem to be much more interested in that than my metabolism, fiber, cholesterol lecture. They are eco warriors and they're after social justice issues. And so that's a whole nother angle that you might find useful in working with your patients. So in my mind, in classes that I work with, I'll show you in just a minute, that shift can work for some other people, maybe more than a health message, okay? So there's also the social justice angle. There's some great books and documentaries out there that didn't exist a decade ago. Food Chains has to do with the tomato farm workers in Immokalee, Florida, and Food Inc. came out a while back, talking really about the implications, the social justice implications of our food choices. And then finally, this other class that I was just talking about brings up sort of this issue of multidisciplinary approaches. This was super fun. We actually got a grant rejected. Tom Robinson, a pediatrician, and I were applying to an NIH proposal to come up with innovative things for young adults that would capture their imagination and change their behavior around food choices. And we said, forget the health thing. We've been doing that, and we've been publishing papers, and they're not changing. How about if we get them to read about food and society issues, animal rights and welfare, global warming, human labor abuses. And so we created a whole class around this, reading popular books, watching documentaries. We didn't have quizzes or midterms. We had them try to write an op-ed about something that they were engaged and enraged about. We had them do YouTubes, trying to change their peer behaviors. We had them blog, and we collected data before and after this quarter. And we actually had 3 of our colleagues as control groups, quote unquote, air quotes. They submitted the same survey before and after to their students in their health-oriented classes. And we published a finding that according to self-report, our students significantly improved their healthful eating without ever talking about health, only focusing on social, ethical, cultural, and environmental issues. And we have data. We have bar graphs, we have p-values for probability, we have statistical significance. We made a composite score out of this. Our students reported eating more vegetables, eating less high-fat dairy, and all the other things were in the right direction. So when we went in a composite score, we had a statistically significant finding. Now, some of you should be chuckling under your breath saying, what a stupid study, because students self-selected into their class, they weren't randomized. The data are self-report. They probably said that to please their professors. And there's no follow-up here to see if they maintain these behaviors. In fact, it's all self-report. Don't even know if they were eating that way. We actually acknowledged all these limitations in the paper. And I think the reason it was accepted for publication is it's kind of presenting a paradigm shift, saying, yes, we know there's lots of flaws. This is a quasi-experimental study. But what we're suggesting is instead of just hammering grams of fiber and milligrams of antioxidants into the argument of why you should eat more healthfully, consider some of these other angles. And honestly, it's been career changing for me. I selfishly did this class to get the data so I could publish it and go back and get the grant, and we never got the grant funded. But I now teach this class 15 years later because I just love the interaction with the students and the enthusiasm that they get. And the observation that nothing works for everyone. For some of the students, it's the animal rights and welfare argument. For other ones, it's the climate change. For other ones, it's the human labor abuse. And so what I find is, as a young PhD, early assistant professor, I would get invited to conferences and I could spend an hour talking about any of these things. And these days, I actually talk about more of these things in my lectures, especially to the general public. And the funny thing is that these resonate more, but when people pursue these angles of food, they end up eating the way I was trying to get them eat when I was pushing individual nutrients or foods to include or avoid. So my summary from all that was, for many people, these external motivators of societal and global health, such as sustainability, might be more powerful and effective as a motivating factor for personal health than talking about health. And yet they lead to the same diet. When they're trying to pursue these same aspirations, they're ending up eating more whole food, less processed food, more plant food, less animal food, less fast food, cooking more at home. I wasn't doing that with my old lectures, and they're doing that when they take this class. So it's quite an epiphany for me to see that. So from the aspirational side of things, I want to leave you with the idea that although the headlines might suggest there's far more disagreement than agreement, I don't think so. When I work on these committees, when the scientific community gets together and examines the evidence, there's an enormous amount of agreement around a foundational diet with some room for personalization, as I showed you in that weight loss study. Even on a healthy fat or a healthy carb diet, there is room for personalization, but let's get the foundation right. And most people agree on that. When we are talking to patients about, I want you to add this or take that away, it has to be instead of what and with what, so we know they're not making a worse decision by replacing something that we wanted them to do with something worse unintentionally. And we might want to use this eat responsibly angle to help motivate some people, some patients, to make those changes. So that's a suggestion I have for you. At the end of the day, we've got to remember people need some joy and deliciousness in their food. So in every talk I give now, I try to make sure I include that plug for joyful and delicious eating. So as a recap, I know this might have been like a fire hose of nutrition in this continuing medical education module. I want to thank the Stanford CME group for allowing me to put this together. And I want to thank their whole team for supporting me and making the slides and setting this whole thing up. So the recap was, how do we know what we know? I went through a few micronutrients that we already know about. I tried to give you some health focus angles to all this and to maybe leave you with ideas for an aspirational diet. I hope you learned something that will be useful for working with your patients. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Stanford CME. Thank you so much for joining this talk.